Good afternoon. I think some of people here know me. I'm Vickie, Ying-En. I'm a student from Inter-Asia Cultural Studies program, University System of Taiwan, based in Jiao Tong University. Yeah. It is really a great honor mixed up with a great anxiety for me to be one of the Professor Nandi's discussants. The school term in this spring, some friends and I joined a seminar course, Sources of the Modern Asian Thoughts, at Nandi, organized by Guangxin. Reading Nandi for most of us was a very inspiring experience, but at the same time suffering. Suffering because Professor Nandi is the kind of thinker, at least for me, whose idea was deeply rooted in the Indian or South Asian cultural historical context. Thus, to develop his interpretation and intervention of the Western categories and the modes of knowledge productions. Professor Nandi, through his methods of political psychology, utilize these resources of thoughts to deal with people's living conditions and psychological formations under the context of colonialism and Western secularized ways of modernization. I would say this becomes some sort of suffering or anxiety during the beginning period of our study group, precisely because we are encountering the unfamiliarity of those resources Professor Nandi inherited and built up the dialogue with. This includes such as Gandhi and Tagore's thoughts. Or to be more accurately, Gandhi and Tagore are seldomly treated as thinkers in Taiwan's academy field and school educations. This reveals our lacking of entering points to root or contextualize ourselves, thus led to the great difficulties for us to develop the process of knowledge productions beyond the Western theoretical frameworks and categories. Gradually, this creates detachments between knowledge and a sense of living realities. Say, memory among common people and community life would hardly be acknowledged as the resources of knowledge production. Not to mention memory work could be the methodology of practicing and producing knowledge. The effect would be our disability to delicately comprehend and deal with our feelings and the sense of living. Correspondingly, but in an ironic manner, we seem to share Lu Xun's accused knowledge conditions to some extent. Though the fortunate thing might be that it was the anxiety or feelings of suffering that we share within the study group instead of indifferences or comfort. For I consider this consistent intensity during reading Professor Nandi's work opens up certain spaces for self-reflection and recontextualization of our modes of thoughts, to borrow Guangxin's term, in relations within human living realities. Feelings and memories would be two of the vehicles to enter into the anonymous yet lively spaces. This is the moment when the experiment of that suffering gradually transformed to the resources for re-evaluation and possible imagination of not only the knowledge formation, but also the formation of the multiple selves. If we all agree that knowledge formation always have their grounded worldviews, and the scope of these worldviews never confine themselves within the nation-state framework and the discipline of the post-enlightenment knowledge system. Therefore, to identify and relativize these worldviews would be the essential task in contemporary times. Enlightened from one of my instructors, Ying-En from National Central University, he pinpointed out that the issue of knowledge formation is not merely about a subject that has been prohibited to be discussed or analyzed, but the critical point here is the closure of episteme, which blocks our attachment to people who have different worldviews compared to ours. It is that this worldview, which contains the holistic framework of the empirical knowledge and the local categories, and as the precondition or the base for discourses or knowledge productions to be possible. And most crucially, it is through the worldview that people define themselves and construct certain meanings to their everyday existence. At this plan, for example, we can see that there is a blockage that hinders certain intellectual or knowledge productions from getting in touch with the multiple worldviews and value systems derived from it, which people internalize as principles of social relations and living strategies. We should gradually limit ourselves within fragmented perspective and imaginations of our living realities, the past and the futures. And by doing so, we fail to acknowledge that there are multiple worldviews out there and that we might share certain links with the other worldviews. If we come to the understanding that our worldview might share some elements of other worldviews, we would arrive at the idea that no single worldview is self-sufficient. To speak further, how can it be possible for us to interpret and design a proper agenda of democracy, quote-unquote, and human freedom based on and in dialogue with the empirical experiences if we fail to have an empathetic understanding and the interlink of feelings with the community life in the village and the people who live at the periphery or outside the normative domain of modernity? Furthermore, how can we get to realize or at least to move step forwards to people's psychological, emotional, and physical conditions for whom themselves and their ways of remembering and living with the past have been objectified and alienated from the history? This idea from Professor Nandi is what inspires me the most. To identify history as one form of memory work, which tend to go along with the certain ideological demands, such as the nationalist narrative of its past, as well as certain modes of history that follows the teleological or evolutionary logic, is just one part of the story. I would like to suggest here that we should at the same time acknowledge that there are still multiple ways of memory work which intertwine with the trajectories of memory, anti-memories, and non-memories that dynamically constitute the so-called cultural memories, which are shareable and revisable within a community, and are able to function as resources of self as well as cultural expressions, and as referential system of knowledge productions. In short, it could be the fundamental infrastructure of the formation of the self and the reproduction of cultural traditions that people rely upon. Here I would like to share some stories to try to develop the dialogue with Professor Nandi. Here's my story. Taiwan indigenous people, in Mandarin is 原住民, tend to be mobilized as one of the major symbols within Taiwan ethno-nationalist historical narrative. Among the history discourses during my high school years, they were divided into categories of Chinese history, which the course title is simply put as history, the history of Taiwan, and the world history. I remember vividly that the stories of Taiwan indigenous people are always about the history of oppression, from the migration to Han Chinese people in Ming Dynasty to Japan's colonial period. But after the national government officially retreated to Taiwan in 1949, it seems that the history of oppression experienced among different groups of people is either negated or marginalized in the history text of school educations. This negation or marginalization within the historical narrative consequently leads to the silencing of those memories, carrying the experiences of suppression and the oppressed people's resistance. It was during the counter-movement and alleged democratization trend, along with the suspension of martial laws in the late 1980s, that the characterization of the four ethnic groups, which includes indigenous people, 原住民, Hakka, 客家人, Hoklo, 福建人, 闽南人, and the mainlanders, 外省人, become a source of political mobilization. And this leads to the hypersensitive divisions among Taiwan society and the relations with mainland China. I won't go on with this problematic of this ethnic categorization, but there's one thing should be noted here. The categorization of the four ethnic groups was legitimized in the legal framework and put into the historical narrative of school educations under the name of multiculturalism. This camouflage of multiculturalism is, in term of the ethnic, oftentimes cover increasingly intensity within Taiwan society, especially when the politics of ethnicity always intertwine with the electoral and party politics. Roughly speaking, this could be seen as the historical process of restructuring of relations between the Taiwan state, political parties, which I'm referring to KMT and DPP, and the society after the political democratization movements in the 90s. On the other hand, the creating of ethnicity required the creating of certain historical narrative in order to legitimize the existence of it. It is arguable that this characterization of ethnicity implies the legitimization of certain historical trajectories of the Taiwan state building process. To borrow Luo Yongsheng's term, embodies the politics of temporality in terms of state building. Besides that, there's the subtext of that nationality as Taiwanese, which is situated prior to these four categories. And the sequence of this ethnicity implies the hierarchical relations within this nationality as Taiwanese. In other words, indigenous people are regarded as the most authentic Taiwanese, and the least is the 外省人. What is in between within this hierarchy is the very complex issue of the so-called native Taiwanese people, 本省人, and the other province people from mainland China, 外省人. And I will not discuss it here, but I would like to problematize the issue of Taiwan indigenous people, 原住民, as an ethno category by sharing my observations and thoughts during my one career year in the urban ghetto of the indigenous people at the outskirts of Hsinchu city in 2012. Taiwan's indigenous people, in the sense of the ethno category as well as their tribal life, are characterized as certain modes of social relations, have constantly been mobilized as either the cultural theme in the Taiwan nationalist historical discourses and the cultural pluralism paradigm, or as the subject for many anthropologies. In Taiwan nationalist historical narratives, it is the oppression and the resistance against the Japanese colonial regime as well as the national governments under the KMT regime that have been documented as historical archive. In other words, the characteristic of the oppression and resistance have been framed by certain ideological purpose. That is to delegitimize both the Japanese colonial regime and KMT, for they were or are the outsiders in Taiwan. What needs to be identified here is, this implies and provides precondition of letting Taiwanese rule themselves. However, peculiarly, what seems to be the most authentic Taiwanese, the Taiwan indigenous people, have never been able to achieve the self-rule within their own communities. What's worse is that many of them have been uprooted from their cultural traditions since the migration from the tribe to the city along the historical process of industrialization and urbanization. Many of them came to the city to find temporary works, such as construction workers, since the 1980s, and still others did the low-level part-time jobs. Some of their temporary habitat located at the periphery of the city has confronted the serious threats by the local governments and real estate companies for the past 1 decade because of the rapid urban expansions and renewal projects. They are the kind of Taiwanese who has lived in the multiple structures of oppression and suffering along the historical process, but only few of those collective experiences and memories have been written down in the history of Taiwan. Perhaps not that surprisingly, their memories and the trajectories of subject formations, along with their migrations from tribe to the city, have been excluded in the national history. It is suspicious that their experience of suffering, discrimination, and exploitation along the process of migration, which were contained in their memories, might shatter the legitimacy of both modernization projects activated by the states and the Western egalitarianism, which is expressed in the language of multiculturalism. The erasure of these memories in the grand historical narrative, on one hand, gradually developed into a kind of perception that those days of staying at the periphery of the city are merely regarded as exceptions in their life. The reality is that most of them have spent over 10 years in the temporary habitat, and many of them keep migration from cities to cities. It is this living with uncertainty and intensity in terms of livelihood and psychic conditions that accumulated into their memories and thus structure their feelings and perceptions toward the surrounded world. This formation of the worldview constructed through memories and feelings is embodied in the process of migration and the everyday life experiences in the urban ghetto, has consequently affected how they situate themselves in relation with the tribe, which they have the sense of belonging but cannot or do not desire to go back, the city, which they can find the sense of belonging only through modernize or individualize themselves, and the urban ghetto, which their sense of belonging and collectiveness are built on the uncertain and intensive living conditions. Some have dreamed to go back to their tribe in the future because that is where their memories could be legitimized and respected, and have the language or expressions to be shared with. It is also where their memories and the empirical and oral inherited knowledge could be provided as the resources of their cultural self-esteem and sense of belongings. However, sadly, this is almost merely the imagination. For many of them know well that it's always difficult when encountering livelihood issues in terms of economic in the tribe, especially among the younger generations. To put it straight, they can barely make a living and gain self-value if they remain in the tribe within the current economical and social surroundings. The geographical distance between tribes and the cities in Taiwan leads to the scale of national modernization, which I was inspired from Taeju's talk yesterday, and urbanization almost equal to the converge of Taiwan Island. One side of the coin would be that the rural village, the tribal life, and as well as all communities in the city are encountering the severe threats of not just their existence, but also their memories and cultural traditions accumulated within those spaces, which enable the collective cultural practices that would perform and reproduce. What I'm trying to suggest here is that as long as the urban ghetto and the living experiences in it are regarded as the exceptions, either of the city or of the biography among those who reside in it, it will therefore lead to a gradual silencing or rejecting of memories back in their tribe. The rejection to acknowledge the living realities in the ambiguous space, such as the urban ghetto, by these indigenous people, will likely to disconnect themselves from the memories and social relations in the tribe. This psychic formation, which is derived from the process of negating certain parts of the memory, would often lead to the negation of the other related memories. Say, if you cannot psychologically situate yourself within the urban ghetto and legitimize it as part of your life instead of exceptionalizing it, the memories back in the tribe would make life in the ghetto even more unbearable, and thus leads to the alienation from yourself and the negation of the memories in the urban ghetto. A compartmentalizing of memories would segment the formation of the selves and thus leads to the vivisectional selves. In reality, it is difficult for these indigenous people to accumulate their memories in the ghetto, and thus to develop into or renew the cultural traditions due to the life there is overwhelmed with suspicions, uncertainties, insecurities, humiliations, and sufferings. To borrow a term from Professor Nandi, this condition might be read as the operation of that principle of the principled forgetfulness. But what would be the baseline of that principle? Would it be possible that the principle of the principled forgetfulness functions along with the erasure of memories by the political forces? These experiences in urban ghetto pushed me to reconsider the term indigenous people, 原住民, for this ethno category has been framed within certain historical discourses which seem to be irrelevant to people's living conditions and the formation of the selves. And it is also because of this ethno category and its interrelated historical narratives that block out our view to look into the trajectories and dynamics of the political cultural shift along the historical process between people who live in the tribe and the migration from the tribe to the city, and their living conditions at the periphery of the city. Concerning that, human tends to build up their worldviews and systems of value inherited from cognitions and interpretations of the world they live in. This would be different from the humanistic perspective toward the issue of human living conditions, which tend to detach individuals from their situated social relations. The memories and the anti-memories of these alleged indigenous people, 原住民, in the urban ghetto should be recognized as and be part of the memories of the city as well as the tribes. In short, the hybridity of memories is the reality. This might be the critical punch toward the nationalist screening of memories. It is through this recognition that enables us to open up our sensibility to track through the trajectories of the human living biographies, which we might find the clues of how the worldviews and the system of values are being bred by the mechanism of memory work. At this point, memory work would be the work of knowledge production, which provide resources for us to critically rethink the issue of the creation of an ethnicity within the context of nationalization, national modernization, or urbanization, by taking up the issue of the indigenous people in urban ghetto as the entering point. This work is not just aiming at deconstruction of indigenous people as ethnic category, but to, in the language of Mexican intellectual and grassroots activist Gustavo Esteva, which actually I was quoted from Professor Nandi's work as well, to regenerate people's space. To sum up, this text would not just to tackle with the issue of human living conditions or the memory work waiting to be analyzed or theorized, but to reclaim the site where the realities of human living conditions and their memories are able to be acknowledged through the self-acknowledgement. Thank you.